Welcome everyone to Maximus Call-In Radio Show number 18. Super glad to be with you here on a Thursday evening. It is a beautiful day here in LA, as you can see in the background here, taking plenty of walks on the beach, and I am glad to spend this hour with you answering questions about mind, body, masculinity, everything related to men's health. So if you have any questions, I love to prioritize people who are willing to ask them live. It's always more fun to get into a discussion about whatever it is that you're facing. So we always prioritize that. If you want to join on Instagram and do a live stream share, I'm happy to invite anyone up. If you're on Clubhouse, I can invite you up. Otherwise, you can type in questions and I'll do my best to answer them as well. Awesome. All right, and I think we got some, let's see if we have anyone on Discord as well. Got Greg joining. Hey, Greg. Good to have you as a regular listener.
Hey, Dr. Taylor, quick question.
Yes, sir. Actually, let me turn up the volume a little bit and see if you can turn yours up as well.
Perfect, okay.
Perfect.
Sounds good.
I can hear you loud and clear.
So, this is a question not really pertaining to me, but it kind of pertains to reality distortion field. I'm kind of curious about it. I watched the WeWork documentary on Adam Newman,
Yes.
and he kind of had this, and Steve Jobs and Bill Clinton, people who are amazing storytellers and visionaries tend to have it.
Right.
I'm curious to hear, your insights on that and how that relates to, being a good storyteller or being really good at, sharing your vision and getting people excited around you, like charisma and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question was around this concept of a reality distortion field. So for people who are not familiar with that term, it's commonly applied to folks that, like you mentioned, Bill Clinton, Steve Jobs, maybe even Elon Musk and Adam Newman, who kind of when you're in their presence, time almost feels like it stands still. You feel very engaged with the person, and they're incredibly sort of influential and engaging. Partly, I think there's a couple components to that phenomenon. Partly, I think it's a power thing, right? Like when you meet Bill Clinton and he's the president of the United States, or now ex-president of the United States, there is just like this natural awe because it's not every day that you get to meet a president. And so I think as a result of that, there's almost like a natural trance that people fall into when they meet people of power or status, and they almost become more receptive to their influence. I bet it was different, quite frankly, when Bill Clinton was a student and quite frankly a nobody before he was president. Like the suit and the position does kind of make the man. In fact, there's really good research on this. These were the Milgram experiments that were done at Yale University. You might have heard the electroshock experiments where they'd bring subjects into an experimental lab and they tell them to shock another participant in increasing dosages of electricity and see at what point would they stop. So the interesting thing is they did a comparison where they had it on campus at Yale with a researcher that was wearing a white coat versus off campus and not wearing the white coat. And as you can imagine, the people who are like a doctor at Yale telling you that this study is okay and you should go electrocute this person, people are more likely to comply versus if you're kind of a nobody. So we know that power and status does influence and persuade people. So I think that's actually one big part of it. The other big part of it is I think you mentioned this in passing, is charisma, right? To me, that's actually the biggest component of it. All those people, to some varying degree, were or are charismatic. And charisma, I actually find to be the key sort of element is really good active listening skills. Like if you talk to people who've met Bill Clinton, they talk about how, they might meet him in a crowd of people. He's busy, shaking hands and kissing babies. But when they're in his presence, they feel like they're the only person in the room with them. And that's actually a skill. You don't have to be president to practice. It's just being really, really engaged, having your full attention with that person, like really like paying attention to their facial expressions, their emotions. You're really in the moment and you're kind of mirror neurons. You're vibing with them, so to speak. And that's actually like a very good proxy for what we do in the context of psychotherapy, right? So when I'm having, live sessions, which are either in person or in video nowadays, I'm really, really trying to be connected with the person, obviously shutting out all other distraction so that you feel very present, and that person feels heard, understood, and respected. In fact, the biggest sort of therapeutic faux pas that you can do is like have your therapist fall asleep on you, right? That's like almost like traumatizing. It might end the relationship. So active listening is a key component of charisma. The other part of it is really like warmth is the way that I would describe it, right? You can be a really good listener, but you're kind of cold. And I think that is more than just like the nodding and the mm-hms that are part of active listening. It's making the person sort of feel, the way that Carl Rogers would put it is unconditional positive regard, right? So this comes from humanistic psychology in the sense of when you're talking with someone, do you feel like they're judging you? Or do you feel like I can basically say anything and I will not feel a sense of shame that emanates from this other person, right? I think that's really like the warmth and compassion, the sympathy. Like if you're telling a story about how something hurt you, they feel sympathetic, right? They feel what you feel. If you're telling a story that you can empathize, you understand what they feel. So all of those components really add, I think, to the charismatic charm that make people, sucked into that reality distortion field. The final part of it is a little bit more personality driven. Actually, all three of those figures that you mentioned actually have very different personalities, right? And not to overly, diagnose, but like Steve Jobs is generally not considered actually like super charismatic per se. He's highly influential. I think people were more intimidated, quite frankly, by Steve Jobs. And I think he certainly was somewhere on the narcissistic spectrum. But narcissists actually can have that reality distortion field as well because they're incredibly confident, right? Narcissists, or at least they are superficially confident in the way that they sort of express or come off. And sometimes just that amount of confidence can create that reality distortion field. So there's great stories of Steve Jobs where he'd kind of walk into a room, listen to a project plan about when the next iPhone is going to be launched, and it's supposed to take 3 months, and he'd demand, why can't it be done in one? And people would just kind of, coalesce to that reality distortion field and do whatever it takes to get done, even though it would seem impossible, right? So, it's almost like a belief is self-fulfilling prophecy. If someone who's highly competent and confident comes in and they're your boss and you're just like, look, we can do this in a month, and you're like, okay, I guess we'll figure out how many nights and weekends do I need to work to make this happen? What resources do I need? Who else can I bring in? And then you kind of make the impossible possible. I don't think you need to be narcissistic, but I do think confidence is the underlying characteristic that drives that. Adam Newman is in a different category. Not to diagnose him, but there's certainly some potential bipolar traits that he expressed, because if you read the news articles about him, they talk about only sleeping 4 hours a night, having meetings at 2, 3 in the morning. And people who are on the bipolar spectrum tend to have hypomanic or what's called manic qualities, right? This is like people who have a very decreased need for sleep, high libido, engage in new projects, and it's this high amount of energy that they express, and that can come off sometimes as charismatic. It's often very effective in sales, right? So when you're pitching, like when people will talk about Adam Newman pitching SoftBank or other investors, he presented a very grandiose vision. And people with bipolar can have delusions of grandeur, but if you are talented and you have the money and you have the team, some of those things that may seem delusional to the ordinary person may sound actually like the next great CEO to a venture capitalist. And so to his credit, obviously he was very great at garnering resources, right? In terms of getting investment money and convincing people to join him in his mission. Now, the problem was the execution was obviously tragically flawed, and obviously WeWork imploded for a number of reasons. And that's the problem with bipolar and kind of mania is it's very easy to start the projects. It's very hard to complete them unless you have a team around you that can help support you and make sure that it is. And you're obviously not biting off more than you can chew, which clearly Adam and WeWork unfortunately did. So obviously, we don't condone or support sort of like mania or kind of manic behavior in order to create a reality distortion field. But I think the underlying trait, just as the underlying trait in narcissism is confidence, I would say the underlying trait in mania is a high degree of positivity, right? Like if you really deep down believe like this is the next big success, you can start like people will believe that as well, right? Versus if you're kind of lying to through your teeth, you're not really confident about yourself or the underlying business, and you're trying to pitch it in the way. I think people can read between the lines. They can read your body language. There's a disconnect. There's some dissonance between what you're saying and how you're saying it. But when you're kind of in it, whether it's a manic state or you are genuinely positive, I do think that positivity and that comes across, and you're like, you know what, this is kind of a crazy idea, but I think this guy can do it. I think this guy can pull it off, and his positivity is infectious, right? So I think that's the underlying trait that you can probably learn from kind of an Adam Newman or kind of a Kanye West, who is publicly actually bipolar and has talked about that, is also very similar, right? When you hear his interviews, he's comparing himself to Pablo Picasso, Walt Disney, all these guys, which sounds ludicrous at the time, but he's literally, I believe, the wealthiest African American on the planet right now. I think he's a multi-billionaire. And so is he at the same status as those guys? I don't know, but he's certainly done a lot both for the music industry and the fashion industry. I would consider him probably close to the top of both of those fields. So, of course you have to back up, what you say, but I think those people have been very, influential about it. So the take-home lesson here is you don't need to be on a pathological spectrum, whether it's narcissism, bipolar, or any other sort of pathology, in order to be influential and create sort of reality distortion fields. I think you can just take the underlying facets, which is a high degree of self-confidence, a high degree of positivity and genuine belief in your mission, very good active listening skills, and emanating sort of a warmth and compassion that makes people feel connected. If you can do those four things, I think you can replicate that to some degree. And the final thing I would say is, look, practice makes perfect, right? These guys, over the course of their lives, probably practice a lot of these skills, whether consciously or unconsciously. But social skills is something you can absolutely practice. And so I would encourage you to do these things in safe context and get feedback from people, whether it's an interview or you're practicing with your friends or you're just going to a party and you're trying to practice your charisma. It can, just by like slowing down, changing your tone, emanating warmth, all these kind of things that we talked about, you'll get better and better at it by kind of analyzing yourself or getting feedback from other people. But yeah, great question. Awesome. Anyone else want to ask any questions live? If not, we can always jump to the question list that people have submitted.
This is Patrick.
Hey, Patrick. Thanks for joining.
Hey, thanks. I wanted to ask you a question about how about like the negative. If this is out of the right realm, please tell me. But
Mm-hmm.
the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, like I don't know, lack of concentration, lack of memory. There's some more psychomotor retardation and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But like I find with depression, like lifelong, multiple relapsing depression, that sometimes on days when don't have the emotional energy, I can't remember any people's names, and it's like a direct match for that. So really, I'm asking for myself as a person that suffers from depression and anxiety. It's
Mm-hmm.
treated, it's in remission, whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But do you have any thoughts on that, or just simple self-care, like eating, sleeping, exercising?
Sorry, what's the specific question? Like when you're having negative symptoms, how to best manage them?
No, I was saying that I can't really call. Yeah, so like how to prevent them or how to manage it.
Yeah. It's a good question. I think, so for people who are not familiar, there's sort of what are called positive and negative symptoms. Positive symptoms are sort of the presence of things that weren't already there. So, for instance, people can be agitated, whether they're depressed or anxious, and it's a symptom that wasn't there before. The negative symptoms is more of the lack of certain things, which is like a lack of energy, for instance, that people sort of experience. They're typically considered harder to treat. Like in the example of schizophrenia, like if you're having positive symptoms, like you're having auditory or visual hallucinations, antipsychotic medications can help people remove those things. But the tougher thing is, they get, flat affect, right? Their emotions are kind of flat, and they're kind of withdrawn, as you were talking about. I think this is like it's a difficult question because I don't think there is, quite frankly, like a mainstream answer or a consolidated consensus answer to this. I do think there are newer generations of medications that are target negative symptoms, and obviously I'm not providing any medical advice, but you should consult with your prescribing provider about it. But I can just talk generally about. So, for instance, there's an increasing research into glutamate and that sort of neurotransmitter system in the brain. So there are a couple, different compounds like N-acetylcysteine, cycloserine, D-serine that focus on glutamate and also the NMDA receptor system. And there's some positive preliminary research that suggests that these drugs that focus on these different neurotransmitters and brain systems may help the negative symptomatology more. So, as part of that may be pharmacological, and some of these things are also over the counter. So obviously consult with your provider and figure out whether those things are sort of helpful for you. So that's on the pharmacological side. I don't focus on that. I focus a lot more behaviorally. And I do think, as you were alluding to, some of the health behaviors, the lifestyle factors do make a big difference in terms of, especially if you're talking about depression and anxiety, the alleviation of some of those negative sort of symptoms. So we know from the research literature that, for instance, physical activity and exercise has a moderate effect on alleviating depression, both all of the symptoms of it, both positive and negative. When it comes to anxiety, exercise actually has a little bit of a weaker effect. It's more of a mild effect compared to the moderate effect in depression. But I do think I always recommend for everyone who's able, physical activity can be very, very helpful in sort of as an adjunctive treatment for depression and anxiety. The problem, of course, is that there's a catch-22. When you're not feeling motivated and your energy is low, it's hard to obviously do physical activity, even though it would obviously help alleviate it. I think the recommendation there is really to find physical activity that you're willing and able to do, right? And that may not be strenuous activity if you're not feeling up to it, and obviously you're not feeling good. I actually think walking is a very, very underrated and underappreciated physical activity. It's not a replacement for obviously going to the gym or doing more strenuous muscle building activity, but look, you gotta start with where you're at. I think for most people, walking is quite accessible. In fact, the first company that I started, Omada, that was actually the main physical activity that we would encourage. We try to get people to do 7,500 steps a day. So kind of a useful rule of thumb. So let's say you're having sleeping issues as a consequence of your depression and or anxiety. One recommendation that I always tell people is walk 1,000 steps for every hour you want to sleep. Meaning, if you're trying to shoot for 7 to 9 hours of sleep, try to walk 7,000 to 9,000 steps. I think it's a useful rule of thumb for everyone, but it's especially true if you have depression and anxiety, because it'll quite frankly just kind of wear you out a little bit more. And so a lot of especially the cogitation, the rumination, the worrying that's kind of going on in your head, if you're anxious, that prevents a lot of people from falling asleep these days. It can help sort of attenuate that. And same thing with depression, which is why I think exercise actually works a little bit better in depression. It's a form of behavioral activation. If you think about it, depression is almost what's called a sickness behavior. Just as you get a cold or a flu and you want to stay at home because your body is like telling you to retreat, kind of protect your immune system so you don't spread it to other people. Depression almost mimics that in a way, and so it encourages you to like stay home and not go out. You don't feel like socializing. The problem is you're not infectious. Depression is not infectious, right? So you almost have to like not listen to what your mind is telling you and say, even though I don't feel like it, I'm still gonna go for a walk, right? So it's practicing this skill of what's called diffusion, right? That even though your mind is telling you one thing, you can say, yes, thank you, I appreciate the suggestion. I know it's coming from sickness behavior, but I can still do something I don't feel like doing, and I'm still gonna get out there and walk because I know it's gonna help me feel better and probably alleviate my negative symptoms to some degree. It doesn't mean that it's gonna be a cure-all or a panacea or I'll get rid of it entirely, but the way that I think about it is quite frankly that like every little bit helps. The other part of behavioral activation that's very helpful is positive activity scheduling. So this is a sort of standard component if you're doing any sort of CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, is in addition to the behavioral activation of obviously doing any sort of physical activity like walking, it's also trying to do things that are pleasurable, right? So when people, you mentioned flat affect, right? Flat affect meaning your mood's really flat. You're not, you don't take, you have your anhedonic, meaning you don't experience pleasure in normal things or everyday things. The treatment for that is to almost like schedule very, very proactively things that you know you would highly likely enjoy, right? Like if you love movies, if you like cuddling with your partner, whatever it is that stimulates you, you go and actually like make a plan, you put it in the calendar and you try to do it, you know, whatever it is, several times a week. And it's just like the physical activity. You may not feel like doing it, and you may not get initially the same reward that you used to get in the past, but it is kind of the self-fulfilling prophecy thing where you're probably not going to feel like it at first. It's not going to be as enjoyable as it used to be at first, but the second, the third, the fourth time you do it, it'll start to make you feel better. Some of the affect oftentimes does come back when people sort of practice these things over time. So that's what I would suggest in terms of, you know, addressing some of these negative symptoms for depression and anxiety is, you know, obviously talk to your provider about, you know, pharmacological options that may help, newer options that may help the negative symptoms. But in addition to that, on the behavioral side, behavioral activation, physical activity like walking, and positive activity scheduling are solid evidence-based recommendations that any good psychologist or psychiatrist would tell you to do. Absolutely.
We got a comment on YouTube. Thoughts on NoFap? Just tell them last episode.
Yeah, a great question on NoFap. We literally covered this in the last episode. You can check us out on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts. So it's a great question, but we've already answered it. So other folks, if you want to chime in, I'm going to invite some people up. Yes, sir.
How are you?
Excellent. How are you, Hamid?
I'm good. So I really enjoy your content. I've been following you for a while. I think you're highly underrated, so I'm expecting a much larger followership for you. I really appreciate the content. It's very deep and very scientific, at the same time very practical. Also, I really like your attitude, just very down to earth and very humble. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
The question I have for you is about hiring a coach. So a person like yourself, I mean, I know you coach CEOs.
Right.
And so recently, and this is last weekend, so I signed up for a program, a one-on-one coaching system on Twitter, and then I was contacted by the marketing person for that coach. And this is a very famous person. I don't know if I should name him or maybe not. So he's very famous on Twitter, you know, almost celebrity status. So I talked to the marketing person who I also happen to be following on Twitter.
Yep.
So I really like the content, and so the only question for me was whether the cost is justified. And because I have no point of comparison, I just wanted to ask you, you know, how would I, as a customer, evaluate these courses or programs without having any prior history of, you know, using these services? Again, there are a few things that I had in mind when, for one thing, you know, it's about the social, or just accountability aspect of it and being, you know, focused. But other than that, I couldn't really, you know, compare. So
what should I pay attention to in making this decision? I have a follow-up call with the market on Saturday. So this is a 9-week program, it's almost $3,000, and so again, that's the determining factor for me.
For sure, great question. You can mention who it is. Like it's not a problem on our show.
PD Magnon, you probably know him.
Yeah. I've seen his stuff. I mean, I do think it matters in terms of who it is. Like, I mean, here's a general recommendation. Obviously, do your research on this person. In that, look, the way that I always put it, like, because people sometimes ask me for coaching, and the first thing that I say in the kind of the blurb that I send people is credentials do not make a clinician, right? In that it doesn't guarantee that this person is good, but it at least gives you some level of confidence that the person is properly educated or trained or verified in some sort of way, right? That like they know what they're talking about. And it's not a guarantee, but I would say it's a much higher correlation, right? Like if you're talking to a board certified psychologist or physician, and you're getting coaching in their particular area of expertise, more likely than not versus random college dropout, they're going to be better. Now, are there some great college dropouts who are very, very intelligent and skilled? Yes, but the risk is higher, and it's up to you if you want to sort of take that risk. That guy that you're mentioning in particular, I believe he has some sort of background in biochemistry. I don't know if he has a college degree in it or something. So I think he has some...
master's degree in physiology, but that's his academic background.
Yeah, I mean, he seems scientifically oriented. He shares research studies. I see that. So I would say at least that's a plus. There's a lot of Twitter gurus out there who are not scientific at all. But I guess my question to you is, what is this course? Like, what's your goal? Like, what are you trying to get out of this that you're going to go spend $3,000 potentially on?
Right. So I had a couple of specific goals in mind because the content itself is not a big deal because, right now we have access to a lot of good stuff online.
Sure.
Including your own channel.
Thank you.
I'm an academic person myself. I'm a university professor.
Yeah.
I've done some coaching myself in sales and marketing. So the content itself is not very important. It's just having those, tricks or maybe, following a very focused, concentrated plan in terms of mindset, the combination of your performance as a result of your physical and mental status, basically. So it's a holistic approach. I don't have any specific goal, but I thought as I have more responsibilities in life, sometimes these things that are very important just lose their importance on a daily basis, and that bothers me. So just wanted to have some plan for maybe a 6 months or 3 months plan, just like a retreat that would put me in this high performance mindset. So that's my main goal. I don't have any specific goal in terms of body fat or specific performance or workout or none of those. Just being a high performing individual. I guess somebody like yourself.
Yeah.
You're a very highly performing person, like surprisingly high performing. So that is my goal.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I mean, I wouldn't spend $3,000 unless I had a very specific goal, because I feel like you're not gonna get out of any program or service unless you're very specific about what you want. So to me, it's a little bit of a yellow flag when you say I don't actually have a specific goal. Now, look, sometimes in the context of, I do occasionally run into clients, although I say it's pretty rare, that they're not super clear on what they want. Although I would try to get within the first 1 to 3 sessions a very clear what's called therapeutic contract in terms of we're going to go through and we're going to figure out what is important to them and whether I'm a good match. I'm not going to make anyone commit to some crazy 6-month program if I'm not convinced that their goals are aligned with what I can provide, and I'm the best person to offer it to them. So let's almost like role play this a little bit. When you say I want a high performance mindset, great, I kind of get the concept. But let's say you did that, and let's say it's 6 months from now, and you have a high performance mindset, whatever that means. What would you be doing differently? What do you anticipate or visualize that, like, how would your life be different as a result of this?
So when I evaluate my performance on a daily basis, on most days I feel like I'm underperforming.
Yeah.
I don't do any labor. I'm either, doing some research projects, I do teaching, I do some investment on the side, making decisions about just life in general, starting a business. Now, in order for me to do those things, I obviously need to take care of my body. Eating is a problem, or, just workout. Now, underperforming means when I look at a typical day, seems like the first few hours are very just random. And also because I've learned not to follow a specific routine. I don't know if it's an excuse or it's just my personality, but it seems like I'm underperforming, meaning the inputs and the output are not very correlated in terms of obviously my expectations. I'm definitely above average in maybe 90% of all areas, but that's not the thing. Because for me, to have a coach, because I've been opposed to the idea of having the coach. I'm very self-sufficient and everything, but I've reached the point where I think it's the job of the coach to maybe tell me what needs to be my goal. So that kind of thing. Because, mentally I consider myself overall, balanced person, no major problems, just energy levels, financially, things like that. But again, I'm very ambitious. So I want to see, okay, my question is I'm underperforming. So it's for somebody to look at, maybe it's, alcohol, maybe it's caffeine, maybe it's just motivation, maybe it's just my surroundings. So that's the feeling I have. That's why I don't have a very specific goal, because my specific goals in terms of, just average areas in life, I can manage those. But it's just, I feel like I'm not that, the best version of myself.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification and elaboration. So now you have gotten more specific, right? Even in the last 5 minutes, when you started, you're saying, I just want a high performance mindset. And I was like, well, what does that mean? You're like, well, given my, self-evaluated ability levels, I don't feel like I'm reaching my level of potential, right? I'm underperforming, to use your words. And I particularly noticed that in the morning time is maybe the area or the time period in which I'm most underperforming. There, you identified some hypotheses about why. Maybe it's because you don't have a sufficient routine. Maybe there's some other external factors as well, whether it's caffeine or otherwise. So it sounds like, yes, you need a good, almost like diagnosis, and a conceptualization. So there's a difference. So usually clients have what's called a presenting problem, right? That's what you basically shared, and say, okay, I think I am underperforming relative to my competency, right? And this is when I notice it the more. I don't know why, but I will come to you and you help me diagnose why. So this actually is exactly why, and I've talked very publicly about this. I'm not a fan of, I'm a fan of coaching. I am not a fan of coaches. And there's an important distinction between the two. I think the only people who should in fact call themselves coaches are sports coaches, right? Because that's just like a common thing in English language. You're like, oh, okay, you're a sports coach. But now there's this new phenomenon of people that calling themselves everything coaches. I'm a life coach. I'm an executive coach. I'm a, I don't even know what, birthing coach. The million other things you can sort of coach. And it's not that it's not helpful to have an external party, help teach you a process. And some of them can be incredibly helpful, right? But I think when it's here's what I would say: the more concrete and non-medical the thing is, I think it's fine to have a non-licensed coach, right? So let's imagine you wanted to be a carpenter, and it's just like, okay, there's a very concrete skill set that I need, and I'm going to hire a carpentry coach. Probably, actually, I don't know. There's probably are licensed carpenters, but I assume if someone was even a self-taught carpenter and they're very competent, they could probably teach you how to do that pretty well, because it's like, I know what I need to do, and it's doesn't require a high degree of education to kind of do that. It's just kind of skill-based. That, I think, it's totally fine. But what you're describing is a little different in the sense that it's a little nebulous, and there's a lot of different factors that could be contributing to your non-performance. So, which could be psychological, it could be physiological, it could be environmental, it could be relational. We don't know until we do a proper assessment. And quite frankly, this is why I always advocate to people, if it has to do a little bit more with like the mental or behavioral realm of things, you should always work with a licensed professional. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is you want to make sure that the person is like legitimate and not a felon. The nice thing about licensed professionals, like you can literally go look me up. There's the California Board of Psychology. Type in my name. I have an active license. I have no complaints against me. I'm background checked. I'm not a criminal, right? Who knows with these Twitter gurus? They could literally be a convicted felon and take advantage of you, take your money, run away, and there's no one you can complain to. In fact, a lot of these Twitter gurus like literally live in Thailand and other countries. You don't know that, and so they could literally abscond with your money. There's no one you could report to. Go ahead, report them to Better Business Bureau. You have no idea. The difference is with me, I am licensed. I can have my license taken away. I can have a complaint filed by the state in terms of violating ethics and norms. And so there's recourse that you have as a customer or client that you just don't have. And I think that incentivizes bad behavior when people are unlicensed and incentivizes good behavior when you are licensed. So that's actually a really critical thing. The other thing is competency to do diagnosis and assessment. So like one of the things that you're reporting, whenever I hear underperformance, one possibility, but I haven't done the diagnosis, is does this person have ADHD or another underlying condition that is contributing to their underperformance? And so, for instance, when I would do neuropsychological evaluations, one of the things that you do to assess underperformance is you actually assess people's IQ, right? And so you see how intelligent is this person, and then if they're in school, you compare it to their grades, right? And if their IQ is far exceeding their grade point average, you're like, there's some clear underperformance here. You can quantify that. And you can assess, okay, why is that? Like from doing various tests, do they have an impairment in their short-term working memory where they forget things really easily, with common symptom of ADHD, and so they're not turning in their assignments because, of that impairment, and they don't have a structure or process in place, which is use reminders, to-do lists, alarms, all these kinds of things, because they lack something that maybe even on a neurological level, people who are naturally not ADHD or naturally conscientious, they don't need all that because they can almost hold it into their working memory. But when you lack that, you're like, okay, I have to sort of acknowledge my biological reality, and so I need to rely more on structure and process in order to make up for it, right? So you won't know that unless someone does a proper sort of assessment and evaluation to be like, well, is this ADHD or is it not? Is it maybe you just like don't have enough structure and process in place in the mornings in general, regardless of ADHD, so you don't know what to focus on or how to prioritize those things. But I would say someone who has a background in working with ADHD clients, whether you have that or not, the behavioral strategies are useful, I would say, in any sort of case. There's other possibilities, right? Like there could be like other issues that are, like I said, you mentioned like sort of caffeine. Is the caffeine causing you to have too much anxiety, and then the anxiety is causing you to procrastinate? It could be that too. So that's why I was like, I really actually, with all due respect to Twitter gurus, I don't think people can really understand if there's a underlying psychological or physiological issue unless they do the evaluation. And by the way, this is not just my point of view. There's a great article. I highly encourage you to read it. It was published in HBR. It's called The Very Real Dangers of Executive Coaching. And it tells a case story about exactly this. It's about a salesperson who's at a company and he's getting in trouble underperforming. And, I think he was working with someone and they just didn't realize like he had some underlying personality issues that was causing interpersonal conflict. And unless you're trained to identify and know that, you're going to miss it. So coaches probably can help a certain percentage of the population just as well as a doctor can, but they're going to miss 50% of the time, or some large percentage of the time, underlying issues, and they're also not going to be competent to treat those things either, right? Like if you have an anxiety disorder, you should use some sort of behavioral therapy and or potentially pharmacotherapy to address the underlying issue. And same thing, if you have ADHD, you may need stimulant medications to get to your optimal level of functioning if the behavioral stuff is not enough, right? So, I mean, that I have a strong point of view about that. You can say I'm biased, but I think it comes with pretty good reason and rationale. The other thing too is if you're going to spend that amount of money, $3,000, you can definitely hire a licensed professional. So my point of view is from what you're describing, and because the conceptualization of why you're underperforming is not clear at this point, a licensed clinician, I would generally say, I mean, from what you're describing, someone who probably has a background in an area, of working with executives. So probably a psychologist who does executive coaching, like obviously similar to my background, or someone who particularly has expertise in sort of behavioral treatments, ADHD, would probably be the most competent person or the highest likelihood to help you.
Okay, so now that you mentioned some of those hypotheses, so I've been working with psychologists and counselors over the years, so I have a very clear picture of my personality. So again, I'm pretty sure I don't have any disorders, and this is based on expert opinion. So nothing, no ADHD, no anxiety disorders, personality disorders. So now that you mentioned conscientiousness, so on the big five
right.
you mentioned, so the only thing that is probably not very great for me in terms of being a high performing person, because I'm very low on neuroticism, which is a very good thing.
Yep.
Also, agreeableness, I'm pretty low, which is I don't know, and then openness to experience very high. Conscientiousness, again, the constructs I'm not 100% familiar, because I've heard people like Jordan Peterson talking about the 2 dimensions of conscientiousness. So I score pretty not the greatest on conscientiousness. So if I want to refer to what you've been discussing, that is probably the issue. But that's the thing. It's like being a healthy person and going to a doctor and then asking them for just life enhancing strategies versus if I'm diabetic. So
yes.
I know I'm not diabetic. So that is why I'm just saying I've done the basic, the research and the homework.
Right.
So I know I don't suffer from any syndrome or the underlying condition.
Right.
Maybe that is the reason, conscientiousness. So on that, do you have any practical?
Yeah, I mean, I would still work with a licensed professional, but you need to find one that works with like a high functioning population, right? I would estimate 80% of my clients do not also have any DSM-5 disorders. Yeah, occasionally they might develop one over the course of treatment if they're going through a divorce or something, but I would actually say 99% of them do not come for actually or a disorder. In fact, almost all of them just say, I want to be more effective running my company or being an executive. And sometimes, I would say 20% of the time, I do find an underlying disorder that may be contributing to it. And that obviously helps in terms of the treatment planning. But yeah, 80% of the time it's not there. So I would, yes, if you're working with someone who's like typically in the managed care system, they only are sick care, they only treat people who have a problem, then yes, they're not going to be the best clinician for you. But I would say folks in private practice who work with higher functioning folks, they specialize in working with executives in particular, probably are going to be a better fit. So
Any recommendations that you can,
I can follow up if you join the Discord afterwards and mention some folks. But in terms of the conscientiousness, this is a great point. So here's the thing. Personality traits are relatively stable. They do change if you're talking about over the course of a lifespan, right? So if you're talking about decades, people do become slightly more conscientious over time. Their neuroticism goes down over time. Their agreeableness goes up over time. We actually kind of mellow it out and kind of become better people, if you will, as we age, which is why, I think that you're very angsty in your teen and 20s, but you kind of chill out. As you alluded to, there are 2 subfacets of conscientiousness, and it may be useful to talk about these for our audience. So conscientiousness, for people listening, there's basically the two biggest predictors of academic and professional success. One is your IQ, which is, mostly inherited. And the second is conscientiousness, which is a personality trait. And funnily, I was just talking to the CEO of Lattice we had a Twitter debate about this just today. And I was saying, look, these are the 2 best predictors. And if you're measuring it directly, it's great. You obviously, like we do at our company at Maximus, we literally do personality and IQ testing so we can find diamonds in the rough. But if you don't, using a proxy like going to Harvard or Google is a pretty good proxy for intelligence and conscientiousness, because they don't let people in unless they're pretty smart or conscientious. So the first component of conscientiousness is an aspect called industriousness. And that's just basically like, do you work hard? And that comes from 3 subfacets. So one is what's called achievement striving. So these are people who like, they want to achieve a high level of success. It's ambition, if you will. And people really do vary quite a bit on this, right? There's some people who are really ambitious and some people who are not. And the way that I actually define ambition is, what are you willing to give up for success? Everyone says they want to be successful, but the reality is like most people actually don't. If you're like, hey, the CEO of a company means you got to work 12, 14-hour days, 6 days a week for the next 10 years of your life, and you're not going to have much fun or a social life. Are you willing to do that to be Elon Musk? A lot of people are obviously going to turn that down. The second is sort of self-efficacy, which is kind of your belief in your ability to be effective, right? Which is a high degree of confidence that you can get what you need done. The third component is sort of self-discipline, which is obvious what that is, right? Which is like, can you stay on task? Do you have good discipline? When you say you're going to do something, are you going to be able to do it? So industriousness is sort of one component. The other component is what's called orderliness. So orderliness is like organization, right? So there's one is cautiousness, which is like you're very careful, you're very meticulous, you double check your work, and that obviously prevents mistakes from being made. The second is dutifulness. So dutifulness is you follow up on things. You know, you make sure that you the T's and the I's are dotted. From end to end, from start to finish, you know, you're making sure that you get stuff done. And then the third is orderliness, right? Which is, do you organize yourself well? Are you organized? Do you not forget things? Do you have systems, processes in place, etc.? And you can just keep on top of a lot of different things. So these are 2 different facets, and it's possible to be high on one, low on the other, and then the combination of both of them essentially makes up your conscientiousness. So the bad news is, conscientiousness is relatively stable. If you're low on conscientiousness, you're probably going to be low for the rest of your life to some degree. You can probably move a little bit, but I've never seen someone kind of go from, let's say, 10th percentile to 90th percentile. You kind of are who you are, and it may have something to do with sort of these underlying neurological facets like working memory, like I was talking about. There's also like probably some personality of like just like distaste for lack of organization. You can think about this. There's some people who just hate having a dirty room and disorganized room, and it's not like they want to do it. It almost like annoys them to be disorganized, and so they can't help but do it. A lot of other people, they don't mind it, so they have to like force themselves to clean and get organized. That's kind of who you are. But I think the good news is you can act in a way that's conscientious regardless of your personality. The way that I describe personality is that they're predispositions. They're not destiny. It doesn't mean that if you're low on orderliness, you cannot be organized. You can make a conscious decision to say, hey, look, this is not my predisposition. I don't mind if things are not organized. That's my tendency. But because in order to be effective, I'm going to be meticulously organized. But the difference is you're going to have to consciously essentially act in a way and plan things to increase your orderliness that someone who's naturally orderly doesn't have to, right? Because it'll just bug them and they'll do it spontaneously. So just like a person who does have ADHD, I would actually argue that people who are low in conscientiousness, and I deal with this with my clients all the time. I definitely have CEOs who are low in conscientiousness. They're very high in openness to experience. You see that combination with highly visionary sort of founders. They need to rely a lot more on structure and process, just like folks with ADHD do, because it doesn't come natural to them. So one thing that's concrete and I recommend to everyone, whether you're on a spectrum or not, is the Keystone habit. Which I don't know if you've ever read this article that I wrote, but it's a system or a process for getting organized and also making sure that you're progressing towards your goals, so that even if you are very distractible because you're not conscientious or ADHD, you can get back on track faster. So to quickly summarize it, you spend 4 minutes in the morning planning the next 4 hours and say, what am I doing this morning? Whatever it is, here's my 1 to 3 top things. And then you check in at noon, like if you did this at 8 a.m. and you check in and say, did I do what I said I was going to do? If not, what got in the way? Like I started, on my morning on social media and then I got down a rabbit hole. Well, great. Next time from 12 to 4, what am I going to do differently? I'm going to dopamine fast, put my phone away, lock out social media, put a software blocker, do whatever it is that I need to do to not get distracted by what impeded me in the morning, right? So the idea is continual iteration, continual improvement, so that you don't constantly make the same mistakes over and over again. It's like, okay, great, I wasted the morning, but I'm going to get back on track in the afternoon. I'm going to pivot and do something different. And so it's basically a habit or a system where you're constantly, and you do this 3 times a day. You do this in the morning, you do this in the afternoon, you do this to the evening. So you plan your day in natural chunks, and it's actually easy to do because you can do it around your meal times, around breakfast, lunch, and dinner, right? And so you kind of use this as a system to plan. That's an example of a behavioral strategy that can be very helpful for, it's not going to increase your underlying conscientiousness, but it's going to help you behave in a way that looks like someone who is conscientious. And in the end, it doesn't matter, right? If someone is acting in a way that's organized, whether or not it comes natural, I don't care, as long as the work gets done. And to you, it doesn't really matter because it's going to help you be more effective. So you may want to, and by the way, people who are naturally not conscientious do benefit from accountability partners. They do benefit from coaching from a licensed professional. So I actually think a lot of the benefit that I provide in terms of the coaching that I do is I check in with my clients every 2 weeks, and they can also text and email or call, whatever in between that. And there's accountability. I'm like, these are the exercises I wanted you to do for the next 2 weeks. And I'm going to check in on you if you're doing it or not. And, there's a little bit of like social pressure. And I do think that actually helps people a lot. If you're not doing it in the context of a clinical relationship, the other advice that I have is join our accountability groups on Discord. So we have accountability groups for this exact reason. You can join them. We put people in the groups. It's free for about 10 to 20 people. And you can work on different things. Some people are working on, working out 3 times a week. Some people are working on being more organized. Some people are working on getting more sleep. Whatever it is, you can just kind of check in. And then there's group accountability because, people will see whether you did it or not. They'll encourage you if you did. And if you didn't, they'll, lightly roast you, if you will. So I think that can be kind of positive social pressure. And I think men in particular like competition. They like accountability and a little bit of pressure, quite honestly. And that's true. If you have that experience procrastinating, a lot of the reason people procrastinate is the pressure helps. So you can almost create a little bit of artificial pressure by whether it's a one-on-one relationship or an accountability group of people who are like your peers working on the same thing together. That can be helpful. Another great example of this, I believe, is a website or app called FocusMate, where 2 people are working on 2 different projects. If you find yourself procrastinating in the morning, Hamid, like you can do is you sign up and say, it randomly pairs you with an accountability partner over Zoom somewhere else in the world. And you're working on 2 different things. Maybe the other person's a graphic designer, you're investing, but you just show up in the Zoom and you say, I'm investing. You're like, I'm working on a design. Great. We're going to hold each other accountable and we're going to just stay on Zoom for the next 50 minutes. And we're going to work together. And, you can share your screen to make sure you're not procrastinating or going on social media. And then at the end, you tell the person whether you did it or not. And it sounds so stupidly simple, but it really, really works because it's really hard to do these things alone. I always tell everyone, like, we're not meant to be alone as human beings. And I think it really does create neuroticism. And I think it creates bad behaviors. And it's very hard that we think that we can have complete self-control when we're quite frankly alone. We just do better with other people. So these are other examples of strategies that can be very helpful. And so whether or not you find someone that you can work with, and I said I'll follow up with you over Discord, these are good examples of strategies that can essentially mimic conscientiousness and help you be more effective so that you can hopefully not be an underperformer, but an overperformer eventually.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I was wondering, Discord is a platform, right? I'm not familiar with Discord. So
Yeah, just type maximustribe.discord.com and you can get an invitation to it's our community.
All the stuff's on our YouTube.
So I just have one short final question. I know we're probably out of time, so just one final question. Is there any moderator or contextual variable under which low conscientiousness is a good thing? Say, for example, because I think about it from an evolutionary perspective. Well, I don't know why we should be conscientious. So I think I know it's personality based, but also maybe socially sort of constructed. So is there a correlation maybe with, say, anxiety or a tendency for anxiety? People who are like, I'm seeing that females are more conscientious.
Correct.
So conscientiousness, at least, trying to use that as an advantage in addition to all the nudges and all the behavioral things that you mentioned that were great. I say goodbye to you. I know I'll listen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'll follow up on Discord.
Much appreciated, and thank you for the kind words. I don't know if there's an advantage to low consciousness. It's not something I'd really wish, but you kind of got the cards that you're dealt in life. But here's the way that I would think about it. We don't look at personality traits in isolation, right? In the sense that, like, look, it's called the Big Five. You look at the other 4 components as well, and you look holistically at the combination. Oftentimes, people who are low in conscientiousness are often high in other things. Like I said, especially with like founders, they're very high in openness to experience. They're very imaginative. They're visionary. They come up with great ideas, right? And so it's not that the low conscientiousness is good per se, but it's often counterbalanced by other things that maybe are good and they are strengths. And I think this is kind of why that old adage of like play to your strengths and do the things that you're good at is very true, right? I would say an early stage founder who's very high in openness to experience, kind of the visionary founder archetype, but low in conscientiousness, the best thing they can do is hire an executive assistant, a chief of staff, and eventually a chief operating officer, because they're never going to be super conscientious, but they can surround themselves with people who are. They can offload that from their mental responsibility and do the thing that they're best at, which is like innovation, product development, idea generation, culture building, all the things that their strengths are. So that's what I would say, is just lean into that. Yes, is it possible? Any sort of extremes in personality, I would actually argue, can sometimes be problematic. If someone's like 99th percentile conscientiousness, yes, there's a higher association with something called OCPD, or obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is different than OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder. People confuse the two. OCD is more like ritualistic behavior that gets rid of anxiety. OCPD is pathological perfectionism. You can be so perfectionistic that it does slow you down. And yes, if you're in a startup, you may need to move fast and break things. So I guess you could say it may be helpful in terms of just moving fast, but I do think everyone should strive to be as conscientious as they can within their reasonable limits, and then the rest that you can't do from sort of behavioral techniques and structures and processes, you should surround yourself with people who are, and set everything else on auto pay, because man, everyone else forgets to pay their bills too. So, all right, thank you for those great questions.
Thank you so much for all the insight. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
We had 2 from YouTube, but we're running out of time, so we can.
Is there any quick ones?
Yeah, one quick one was. All right. Yeah, we had a question from YouTube. Do you have any quick hacks to be more alpha in a social situation?
It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, so this kind of goes to like what is being alpha in a social situation. That we won't get into the whole definition of sort of an alpha male, and if there even is alpha males in a human context. But I think what people generally refer to as in a social context is the person who's like the center of the attention, the life of the party, the person who is probably a little bit more the dominant kind of person in the group. So first thing I would actually say is you don't necessarily need to be the quote unquote alpha or the dominant person in a social situation to be effective. So, especially if you're at a big party, you can kind of find your little niche of people that are maybe drawn to you, right? Like introverts, for instance, may not like the person who's like the super dominant, extroverted center of attention. They may want to be with someone who can like a little bit of a better listener, etc. So I would just question the assumption of like whether it's always a good thing. But I think the main thing, honestly, if you still want to do it anyway, and it is effective in that particular context, is to bolster your confidence, right? I do think alphaness, if for whatever it's worth, can be just like we were talking about, sort of faking conscientiousness or mimicking conscientiousness. You can kind of mimic alpha behaviors, right? And I think confidence is the thing that comes across the strongest in a social context. And whether or not you feel it, you can fake it till you make it, right? There's like useful, Paul McKenna talks about this, right? When he's like walking across the room and he's saying negative things to, his mind is saying negative things to himself in terms of, oh, she's going to reject me, this is going to be really embarrassing. You can sort of counteract that negative self-talk by just kind of diffusing from it, saying, thank you, mind, for those unhelpful suggestions, but kind of do positive sort of reprogramming and say, hey, you know what? I am a person of worth, and this person, hopefully is like lucky to talk to me. I have something valuable to contribute, and if she rejects me, then it's her loss. Not because I'm the greatest, person to walk the earth, but maybe it's just not a good fit for me, and that creates room for me to find someone who really does appreciate me for who I am. So that kind of positive self-talk does bolster your confidence, and then that inner confidence comes out as external confidence as well. So I think practicing those kinds of things can help you feel, look, sort of mimic alphaness if you want to go that route. So quick little tip there. All right. Great questions, everyone. We had a very engaging show today where we talked on a number of topics. We talked about bolstering self-confidence in social situations, as we just talked about there. We had an earlier question about how do you create a positive sort of force field and charisma, just like Elon Musk or Steve Jobs or Bill Clinton and other great sort of luminaries have done, and you can do that without sort of being on the pathological spectrum. Had a great question about how do you find a great coach to work with if you want to improve your performance, and why it's very helpful to work with a licensed clinician regardless of whether or not you are pathological, because they can help better identify, diagnose, conceptualize, and come up with a treatment plan that's appropriate for you. So awesome. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'll follow up with some resources on our Discord, which you can find at maximustribe.discord.com. Keep the questions coming. You can submit them on whatever channels that you're on, and we'll answer them for next week. So you can join us next Thursday, 6 to 7 p.m. Pacific time. Thank you so much, and have an amazing rest of your day.